Her name was Louise Luetgert. It was the morning of November 12, 1872. She was 17 years old, and she was standing on a Hudson River pier with her younger brother. His name was Diedrich. He was 15. They had come 10 days across the Atlantic in the steerage of a Norddeutscher Lloyd steamer called the Maine, out of Bremen. The harbor air carried the cold off the water. Louisa did not yet speak English. They were going to Chicago. Their older sister Wilhelmina had come to America before them and was already there, on the German-speaking north side. Wilhelmina was the reason they had come, 1,000 miles further west than where they were now, where the pier ended and the country began. The brother and sister were two of about 250,000 Germans who came through the port of New York in 1872. There was nothing unusual about their arrival. What was written down was the ship's name, the date, the port of departure, and their 2 ages. Everything else, the trunk, the sister's address in Chicago, whatever sentence in English they had practiced for the customs man, has not survived. 25 years from this morning, Louisa would be missing in Chicago. Her husband would tell the police she had run away to Germany. The 15-year-old boy standing beside her on this pier would be the only person who refused to believe him. Her name was Louise Luetgert. The boy beside her was Diedrich. They were both alive that morning. Louisa got to Chicago in the closing weeks of 1872. For the next 5 years, she worked as a domestic servant in her sister's household, on the German-speaking north side of the city, in the part of Chicago where you could go your whole day without needing to speak English. The period press would later say that when she married, she knew scarcely a word of it. She had been in the country 6 years. In November of 1877, a Chicago tanner turned saloonkeeper named Adolf Luetgert lost his first wife. Caroline Ropke had died in childbirth. He was 32. He had 2 small sons. 2 months later, on January 18, 1878, he married Louisa Luetgert at St. John's Lutheran Church on the corner of LaSalle Avenue and Ohio Street. The minister was Pastor Joseph Hartman. The bride was 23. She spoke her vows in German. Adolph gave her a ring. It was gold. It was engraved on the inside with her new initials, LL. Remember the ring? The wedding was small. Chicago that January was a city still rebuilding from the Great Fire 7 years earlier. The streetlights were gas, the streetcars were horse-drawn, and the population, over 500,000, was about 1/3 foreign-born, with a great many of those foreign-born from Westphalia and Saxony and Hanover. It was an ordinary marriage in an ordinary year. That is part of what matters about it. The Luetgerts' first home was a set of rooms above the saloon Adolph, operated on Webster Avenue. In the photograph that survives of Louisa from those years, she is small. The press would describe her. Petite, 5 feet tall, 115 pounds. The ring was on her finger. For the first decade of the marriage, the Luetgerts built. They built capital, slowly. They built a household. They built, between them, 4 children. The capital came first from the Webster Avenue saloon. The period press, writing in the months after Louisa's disappearance, described what she had done in those years. The phrase it used was that Mrs. Luetgert scrubbed and was content to live in small rooms over the saloon while the profits piled up. She was thrifty. The 2 of them planned together. The first money to leave the saloon for something else, a small meat route in 1879, was money she had been part of saving. The household moved with the work. Webster Avenue, North Avenue, a small farm out near Elgin where Adolph thought for a season he might try farming. Then back to the city and a sausage shop on North Avenue. By 1892, Adolph had purchased the land at the southwest corner of Diversey Parkway and Hermitage Avenue. He paid $30,000 for the lot, and he spent another $140,000 to build the 5-story factory on it. The Luetgert family home went up next door. The 4 children came in those years. 2 of them, both before the age of 2, did not survive their early childhood, a son and a daughter. The Bicknese family records have not preserved which illnesses took them. The 2 who lived were boys. Louis was born around 1885. Elmer came a few years after. Louisa raised them. She kept the house next to the factory. She had been a domestic servant once, in her sister's home, when she had not yet learned the language. Now, in 1893, she was the wife of one of the largest sausage manufacturers in Chicago. She was 40 years old. She had buried 2 children. She still spoke English a little carefully. The 2 boys spoke it the way American boys speak. This is what the marriage looked like before it broke. The man Louisa had married had crossed the Atlantic at 20, with $30 in his pocket. Adolphe Luetgert had been born in the village of Gütersloh, in Westphalia, in December of 1845. By 1872, he had saved $4,000 in Chicago tanneries, and he had used it to open his first business. The sausage company came in 1879. The factory at Diversey and Hermitage came in 1892. By 1893, when his frankfurters were being served at the World's Columbian Exposition, Adolphe Luetgert was, in the language of his neighbors, a man. The Chicago Tribune, writing in October of 1897, recorded the deference he had received in those years. The neighborhood, the paper said, gave him a wide berth when he came down the sidewalk with his 2 Great Danes panting after him. When he spoke to the men in the streets, they pulled off their hats. He employed more men than anyone for almost a mile around. To the people who lived nearby, the factory at Diversey and Hermitage was the place where all the money in circulation originated. That is enough of him for now. The summer of 1893 was the high point. From May through October that year, the World's Columbian Exposition opened on the lake shore in Jackson Park, 6 miles south of the Luetgert factory. 27 million people passed through its gates over 6 months, more than a third of the country's population at the time. Among the families who came through the Midway in those summer months were Adolphe and Louisa and their 2 surviving boys. 3 years after the fair closed, the Panic of 1896 began. What happened to the Luetgert household between the closing of the exposition and the spring of 1897 was, in its outline, what happened to a great many American households in those years. Sausage orders fell. Customers couldn't pay. A man Adolphe had been negotiating with to sell part of the business turned out to be running a swindle, and he lost the money he had committed to that sale. He borrowed deeply from the Foreman Brothers Bank. By the spring of 1897, he was past saving the business. He was simply postponing what was going to happen to it. He had been postponing the news at home, too. Louisa had been used to a particular standard of living, and when she discovered what shape their finances were actually in, she began to fight with her husband. The neighbors heard them. The fights, the period press would later record, were loud and sometimes violent. Louisa told several people in those months that she was planning to leave him. There was, in the household, a young woman named Mary Siemering. She was 22. She was the family's housemaid. She was also a cousin of Louisa's, the daughter of one of the Bicknese sisters who had stayed in Germany, sent over to live with relatives. Mary made up the bed in the small room next to Adolphe's office at the factory, where Adolphe had taken to spending many of his nights, ostensibly to keep an eye on the business. One of the factory workers had seen her kissing him there. Adolphe had also been writing letters to a wealthy widow named Christina Feld. In them, he described a rosy future together. The phrases were not, strictly speaking, hypothetical. On Friday, the 30th of April, 1897, Adolphe Luetgert went to a druggist and purchased a quantity of arsenic and a quantity of caustic potash. Potash is a strong alkali. It is used, among other things, in the rendering of fats into soap. He paid in cash. He brought the parcels back to the factory. Saturday, the 1st of May, was warm. Louise Luetgert, who was 12, had spent the evening at the circus, and a little after 10 o'clock he came home full of what he had seen. His mother was in the kitchen. The house at Diversey and Hermitage had gaslight in the kitchen and a coal stove still warm from supper. Louis went to her the way a 12-year-old does when something has been wonderful, and he began to describe the things he had seen. There had been a giant called Monsieur Goliath. There had been a man who juggled cannonballs. Louisa listened. The boy was telling her, and she was listening. His father came into the kitchen. It was about 10:30. Adolphe told the boy it was time for bed, and Louis bid his mother good night, and the kitchen door closed behind him as he went up the stairs. That is the last preserved exchange of Louise Luetgert's voice. A short time after the boy had gone to his room, Louisa was seen entering the factory in her husband's company. The factory was a few yards from the house. Its basement contained the steam vats in which the sausage casings were prepared. One of the vats that night was being heated. The night watchman was a man named Frank Bialk. Adolphe spoke to him in the basement. He told Bialk to start the steam, and Bialk did. He sent Bialk out to a drugstore on a small errand for a patent medicine. When Bialk got back, he was told to take the rest of the night off. The vat heated. The arsenic and the caustic potash from the previous afternoon were on the premises. What happened in the basement of the factory at Diversey and Hermitage between the time Frank Bialk left and the time the night was over is not in the record. There were no other witnesses. The means by which the body was dissolved were efficient enough to leave very little of it. The means were also chosen. When the children of the household woke the next morning, Adolphe told them their mother had gone the previous evening to visit her sister Wilhelmina and had not yet come back. She did not come back the next day either. He did not call the police. A few months earlier, Adolphe Leckert's Great Dane had run off. When the dog ran off, Adolphe went, that same day, to the neighborhood police precinct. He asked for help in finding the dog. For 7 days after his wife disappeared, he told family members and acquaintances who inquired that Louisa had simply left him. She might have gone away, he would say. She might have wandered away. Something like that. The boy who had told his mother about the giant slept in his room next to the factory. He was 12. By the 8th of May, Louise's brother had heard enough to be alarmed. Diedrich Bicknies was 40 years old that spring. He had crossed the Atlantic with his older sister 25 years earlier, when she was 17 and he was 15. He was not, in 1897, a wealthy man. He was not, by any contemporary description, a forceful one. But he understood what his brother-in-law had told him about Louisa, and he understood that it could not be true. He went to the police. He was the first. That week, the police searched. In the places, people then searched for the missing. They dragged the Chicago River. They went through the clay pits along the rail lines. They looked in Kankakee, where the Luetgerts were said to know people, and out in Wheaton, west of the city, and at the small farm in Elgin, where Adolphe had once tried farming. They found nothing. In the meantime, Adolphe Luetgert was being interviewed by the newspapermen who had begun to circle. He was calm in his interviews. When asked where his wife had gone, he gave the same answer he had given Diedrich. She might have gone away or wandered away, something like that. The newspapermen wrote it down. They also noted his manner, which was unhurried. On the 15th of May, 2 weeks after the Saturday in the kitchen, Frank Bialk went to the police. He told them what he had been asked to do on the 1st of May. The steam, the drugstore errand, the rest of the night off, the vat that had been heated when there was no production scheduled. He did not say why he had waited 2 weeks to come forward. The police did not, that day, press him on it. They went to the factory. The vat was in the basement. It was an iron tank about 6 feet across, used in the preparation of the sausage casings. The The basement was gaslit. When the policeman who had followed Frank Bialk's tip looked into the tank, it was about half full of a thick reddish-brown fluid. The smell was foul. The vat had been cleaned 2 weeks earlier. The residue had returned. There was a plug at the bottom, on the outside, for emptying it. The policeman pulled it. The fluid began to come out. It was the thing Bialk had been asked to start the steam for. When the slime had drained, there were objects at the bottom of the tank. There were small bone fragments. There were 2 gold rings. One of them was a wedding band. It was engraved on the inside with 2 letters, LL. It was the ring Pastor Hartman had blessed at St. John's Lutheran Church on the 18th of January 1878. It was the ring Adolf had given Louisa on the day he married her. It had been on her finger for 19 years. The men in the basement also found, in the slime and on the floor around the tank, and in an ash heap a few yards from the smokehouse, a number of other objects. There was a strand of hair. There was the half of a false tooth. There was a hairpin. There were several charred metal stays from a woman's corset. There were scraps of cloth. That same day, the police arrested Mary Siemering, the housemaid. The fact that emerged in the next few hours of questioning was the fact that had been hidden underneath the affair. Mary was not a stranger to the household, who had become Adolf's lover. Mary was Louisa's own cousin. The young woman who had been making up the bed in Adolf's factory office was a girl of Louisa's own blood, sent to Chicago to live with relatives, and given a place in the Luetgert household by the woman she had then betrayed. Louisa had not known. The 2 boys had not known. Mary Siemering had been arrested in the only room she had to herself. The police also retrieved, from Adolf's records, the receipts for the arsenic and the caustic potash he had purchased on the 30th of April. The procurement and the use were now joined. On the 17th of May, 2 days after the vat had been drained, Adolf Luetgert was arrested at the factory. He continued, then and afterward, to insist that his wife had simply run away. The first trial began at the Cook County Courthouse in late August of 1897. Judge Richard Tuthill presided. The prosecution was led by the state's attorney, Charles S. Deneen. The defense was led by William Vincent. The courtroom held 1,000 people every day. Women came in particular numbers. Newspapermen had come from across the country, including Julian Hawthorne, son of the novelist, writing for William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal. Reporters tried to eavesdrop on the jury deliberations. Some got close enough to be removed. Vincent's defense was that Louise Luetgert was not dead. People all over the country, he said, had seen her. Sightings had come in from a dozen states. Some were hoaxes. One in New York came from a man named Grotti, who turned out to be a serial fabulist who had previously claimed to have spotted other missing persons. The woman he had seen was real, but she was not Louisa, and the case collapsed. Most of the rest were of women who were ill, or wandering, or traveling alone. The bone fragments from the vat were the case's center, and the bones became the case's argument. Prosecution experts identified the fragments as those of a small woman. Defense experts said it was impossible to say they were even human. Each side conducted dissolution experiments on cadavers, and each side proved its own assertion. Adolf Luetgert sat through it. The reporters, watching him, described his manner as unconcerned and overly confident. On the 21st of October, after 3 days of deliberation, the jury came back without a verdict. The judge declared a mistrial. The second trial began at the same courthouse in January of 1898. The same judge presided. The same prosecutor argued. The decisive new element was a man named George Amos Dorsey. Dorsey was the assistant curator of anthropology at the Field Columbian Museum in Chicago. He came into the courtroom with the bone fragments from the vat in front of him, and he identified them. There were pieces of skull. There were pieces of femur. There were metatarsals, bones from the front of the foot. There was the phalanx of a toe. There was the head of a rib. They had all belonged, Dorsey said, to a small adult woman. At the second trial, he testified in even stronger terms than at the first. Adolf Luetgert took the stand in his own defense. He spoke for 18.5 hours. The prosecution introduced the letters he had written to Christina Feld. The phrases about a rosy future were read aloud in court, and the motive landed. On the 9th of February, 1898, the jury came back. They had agreed. The verdict was guilty. The sentence was life at the Illinois State Penitentiary at Joliet. In the courtroom that morning, 8 months after Diedrich Bicknese had told the police his sister was missing, Louise Luetgert was named as the dead woman she had always been. Adolf Luetgert lived 18 months at Joliet. He insisted until the end that his wife was alive somewhere. On the 7th of July, 1899, he was found dead in his cell. The cause was given as fatty degeneration of the heart. He was 53. He was buried at Forest Home Cemetery, west of the city. He is not the afterlife of this story. The afterlife is the people Louisa left behind. In the weeks before Adolf's death, a Chicago court had awarded the guardianship of his 2 surviving sons, Louis, now 14, and Elmer, who was younger, to Louisa's brother. Diedrich Bicknese had crossed the Atlantic with his sister 27 years earlier. He had reported her missing when no one else would, and in the summer of 1899, in his sister's name, he was given the care of her sons. The court required a bond of $500. He did not have it. He did not appear in court on the day the bond was due. He lost the guardianship. The brother who had been on the boat with her in 1872 and who had been in the police station with her name in 1897 was the brother who could not, in 1899, complete the care of her sons. The bond was real. The failure was real. The love was also real. The boys lived for a time with one of Adolf's former business associates. They moved, in time, to the household of their aunt, Wilhelmina Mueller, Louisa's older sister, who had come to America before Louisa had, and who had been the reason Louisa had come to Chicago in the first place. The family circle, having broken, closed back around the children.